Good. Well, welcome those online and those here in the hall to this meeting on how humanitarian arrangements can help in armed conflict to protect civilians and to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance. We're not under the Chatham House rule. We're on the record and being recorded. I'm instructed to say, in the case of an emergency, please leave via the fire exits on your left and your right. If you tweet, please do, using #CHEvents and @Chatham House. And those online, please submit questions throughout the event using the Q&A function. Now it's civilians who bear the brunt of so many conflicts, whether by death or injury or by destruction of their homes or essential infrastructure. And we're going to talk today about various humanitarian arrangements which can be established in the course of the conflicts. What are they? Do they work? Is there any point to them? What can be done better? The International Law Programme has prepared and is launching this paper, Enhancing the Security of Civilians in Conflict. You can find it online. And it describes 6 humanitarian arrangements: notification arrangements, evacuations, humanitarian corridors, suspensions of hostilities, ceasefires, that sort of thing, protected zones and no-fly zones. That's the sort of thing we're going to be discussing this evening. The project that has resulted in the paper was funded by the British Red Cross, and our thanks, as always, to the BRC and to Michael Meyer for their support. I'm told that the British Red Cross are thinking of different ways to promote the topic, and one possibility might be to raise it at the 34th International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent in October. Now, our speakers in alphabetical order. Mark Bowden has worked in the humanitarian sector for over 30 years with NGOs, the UK government and the UN. He was formerly the Assistant Secretary General at the UN, and he's now a Senior Research Associate at the Overseas Development Institute and an Associate Fellow here at Chatham House. Colonel Mark Dacres, Mark over there, is at the Ministry of Defence, but just prior to his present posting, he was at the Institute of International Humanitarian Law in San Remo, where he was responsible for training military officers from many countries. Emanuela Chiara Gillard, Associate Fellow here at International Law. She has written the paper, so she is the author. And she's also at the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. Michael Hoffman is a senior humanitarian specialist at Médecins Sans Frontières. He's worked in Liberia, the DRC, Bosnia, Burundi, Sri Lanka, Brazil, South Sudan and Kosovo as emergency coordinator, and he has later worked in Afghanistan, so all through the bad places, the difficult places. I should say that although there are 3 lawyers up here, there will not be a lot of law discussed today. It's the practice, not the law, that's mostly the difficulty. What we're going to do, we've got some pre-prepared questions, and I'm going to ask them to our speakers. At the same time, I'll be looking to see if online there are other questions, and we can mix those in. When we've finished up here, we will throw the floor open to questions from you. So, to begin, Manu, why does the paper need to be written at all? And why, essentially, do humanitarian arrangements need to be made? Why are we talking about this at all?
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. And I'm actually going to answer your questions in reverse order. Why do humanitarian arrangements need to be made? As you noted, civilians are caught up in fighting in many current conflicts, particularly those that are taking place in densely populated areas. And humanitarian arrangements are practical ways to spare civilians from the effects of hostilities, which is a general obligation under international humanitarian law. The arrangements do this in a variety of ways, by, for example, enabling civilians to leave areas of active hostilities and to move in safety. This is the case of evacuations and humanitarian corridors. Other arrangements, such as humanitarian notifications, aim to enhance the security of humanitarian organizations that are trying to respond to civilians in need. And these too are a way of giving effect to obligations under IHL to respect and protect staff of humanitarian organizations and to allow and facilitate their operations. So those are what are humanitarian arrangements in general. Why is it necessary to write this paper? It's natural to look for practical ways to alleviate the impact of fighting on civilians. And we often see a flurry of well-intentioned calls to establish a variety of arrangements. But frequently, these are without a proper appreciation of what precisely the arrangements are, what is necessary for their establishment and implementation, and possibly even more importantly, whether what's actually being called for is the modality that's necessary and would actually be helpful in that particular context in enhancing the security and facilitating humanitarian response. So the paper aims to contribute both to a better informed conversation, but possibly even more importantly, better practice on the ground. And what we've done is consider a number of humanitarian arrangements that have been discussed in recent conflicts. And with regard to each arrangement, explaining what it is, what is necessary practically for its establishment and operations, identifying problems that have arisen, and also, importantly, elements of good practice and recommendations. And then the paper also identifies the law, principally international humanitarian law, that's relevant to each arrangement. And as you said, it's not really a legal discussion so much. It's important to know what the law says. The arrangements don't affect existing obligations of belligerents and the protections afforded by IHL to civilians, the wounded and sick, and the staff of humanitarian organizations. They are rather a practical way of giving effect to these obligations and protections.
Thank you. I'm going to throw it back at you to now come to specific arrangements. And we're going to look first at humanitarian notifications. But before we do, I'd like to just turn to you, Mark, if I may, just to ask, in your experience, the sort of arrangements, humanitarian arrangements that Manu has been talking about, you've had an extensive experience, and when are such arrangements called for in practice?
Well, I think it's a rather difficult question to answer at the moment because certainly civilians are far more at threat than they've ever been before, but the nature of conflict has changed quite dramatically over the last the last two decades, with far more fragmented conflict, far more atomized conflict, and the knowledge of belligerents of both IHL and other issues has become rather vaguer, shall I put it that way. So I think there is a challenge as to when to use these issues. Clearly, there are some conflicts where it's been very important. Syria has been one, where the conflict in Syria has required humanitarian corridors as a means of getting aid. But the other arrangements, we will go through them. Evacuations, I think, are very difficult in terms of both the logistics and the capacity to undertake those. In all of these issues, there's an underlying sense of what role the United Nations can play in these issues and what responsibilities it can take, which adds a further challenge to this. So I think to answer the question, there are some conflicts where it's useful, but the majority of threats that civilians face, the important issue is about gaining unimpeded access rather than using specific tools.
I mean, as soon as there's a conflict, you do get everyone saying, we must have a pause, we must have a corridor, we must have a, some kind of humanitarian arrangement. Is that always the appropriate thing to do?
Well, it depends. In terms of mediation, it takes quite a lot to work towards a ceasefire or a pause. I think there needs to be, this is where sort of diplomacy comes in, and the background work required to get towards a ceasefire or a pause is actually quite considerable and takes a length of time. So it's not really an immediate measure. For example, when I worked in Afghanistan, one of the main issues was actually to get a definition of who was a civilian, because all government employees were assumed to be combatants. So we were dealing with definitions before we got to the stage of a ceasefire, and the discussions around ceasefires took a couple of years.
That's interesting. Thank you very much. Right, turning to specific arrangements then. Manu, notifications, humanitarian notifications, what are they?
So they're a voluntary system whereby humanitarian organizations share information in a structured manner with parties to an armed conflict on their location of the facilities that they use for their operations, such as warehouses and offices, and also on their movements, such as humanitarian convoys. And the objective of notifications is to assist belligerents, to assist them in identifying the notified facilities and movements so that they can be taken into account when they plan and conduct military operations in line with their obligations under IHL. The precise arrangement of humanitarian notifications have varied context by context in terms of which actors gather and share the information and convey it to the parties to the armed conflict. OCHA, the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, usually carries out this coordinating role for UN agencies, funds and programs and implementing partners in the particular context. There are certain organizations such as the ICRC and MSF that don't participate in these collective arrangements but carry out their own bilateral notification arrangements. What also varies significantly from context to context is what is notified. So notifications are usually static humanitarian facilities such as warehouses and offices, and movements such as humanitarian convoys for humanitarian activity. However, we've seen across contexts that there is no shared understanding of what constitutes a humanitarian facility for the purpose of humanitarian arrangements. And in some contexts, this has been interpreted extremely broadly. So to give you the most maximalist approach, in relation to Yemen, the notification arrangement operated by OCHA includes some 28,000 locations. So very, very extensive. Who is notified? It depends on the party that's coordinating the arrangements. Humanitarian arrangements operated by OCHA have principally been with state parties to armed conflict. And this is even in relation to non-international armed conflict such as Yemen, for example. The notifications were only going to the states that were participating. And to date, this has been principally because it's states that have been carrying out air operations. It's in relation to it's principally states that carry out air operations, and it's principally in relation to air operations where perhaps they lack the situational awareness that notification can play a more significant role.
Thank you. Michael, what's MSF's experience of notifications?
Yeah, first of all, the notifications now, when people talk about it, is usually about GPS coordinates and lists that are sent to states indeed, because it's the states that have the air forces, usually not the rebel groups. But of course, the idea of notification predates even the invention of GPS and the likes. And on the ground, it's mostly about identifying your hospitals, your warehouses. So indeed, belligerent parties, if they agree to your presence, also agree not to attack these premises. And the majority of notification, therefore, happens really on the ground level, on the actual location, in a face-to-face with local commanders of either state armies or non-state armed groups, and don't involve GPS coordinates at all. It just involves, this is our hospital, we will clearly put a marker on the outside, a big flag, you agree to our presence, so then please do not shoot at the cars, the warehouses, the hospitals that have this recognizable logo. When it then comes indeed to warfare that involves states, and I'm not sure if the current trend is atomized warfare, because if you look at the big conflicts that we're dealing with now, Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, these are all essentially state armies with the arsenal of a state army, artillery, air force, drones now, missiles, where indeed GPS-based notification becomes relevant. And our experience is a mixed bag. There are a few contexts where it seems to serve a purpose, where indeed if internally we are disciplined enough not to give a list of 20,000 apartments that may or may not have an MSF staff in it, but really focus on the hospitals, the medical warehouses, and the medical convoys that go in between. In some conflicts, like the current conflict in Sudan, it seems to be a little bit effective. So there were some close calls, but by and large, our direct engagement with, which are essentially two state armies that have broken apart in not bombing or shelling these premises have worked. In other contexts, it seems to be virtually useless. If we look at Ukraine and Gaza, for instance, yes, we do notify the parties, but there seems to be very little correlation between us telling about these premises and actually noticing on the ground that there is a special consideration for hospitals especially. And hospitals, of course, they have an additional layer of protection. Under IHL, of course, every civilian target is supposed to be spared, but then for hospitals there's an additional layer that specifically asks the warring parties to respect the medical mission. And in Gaza and Ukraine, we don't see that our notification has a significant effect on, I wouldn't say it means hospitals are specifically targeted, but it's clearly they're also not specifically spared. And then in Ukraine, you refer to the Syrian war, we had an additional constraint. Most of the time MSF, of course, doesn't build their own hospitals, but we come in and assist existing hospitals that belong to ministries of health or other organizations. And in Syria and Ukraine, we are quite willing to share the coordinates of these hospitals in Ukraine with Russia and in Gaza, obviously with, in Syria with the Russian and the Syrian authorities, that they don't want us to share that because they believe that by giving those coordinates you make those hospitals a target. And that means that since it's not our hospital and not our decision, we specifically refrain from sharing those coordinates. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then these hospitals gets hit, and then the warring party can say, but you know, it was not on your list, so it was a legitimate target. And the other side said, you see, I told you that they were going to bomb that hospital if we give the coordinates. So we are kind of in a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the utility in Syria and Ukraine is close to zero.
And in Gaza as well, you were saying?
Gaza for sure, yes.
Yeah.
In Gaza, it's now come to a point where exceptionally, normally MSF doesn't comment on the dynamics of the conflict, so calling for a ceasefire is for MSF is very exceptional, because essentially a ceasefire is a military and political process and not a humanitarian process. And it's not up to us to dictate when a war has to stop and which gains of territory or one or the other party is enough for them to stop. That's a political and military decision. So normally we don't do that. But in Gaza, since the destruction and the violence is so extreme, I think so far we've lost 2 staff and 6 associated staff, of a total of 200 staff overall in the humanitarian community that have been killed. There is no safe area. Either humanitarian premises or hospitals are certainly not spared in any way or form. And the humanitarian needs are now so extreme as a result of that, that exceptionally in Gaza we say all these notification systems, deconfliction systems, corridors, safe zones have become so irrelevant to the actual humanitarian situation that the only thing that we think is reasonable to ask for in this case is just stop. You know, just stop, ceasefire. But that's exceptional for MSF to do that.
Thank you. Mark Dacus, now you, MOD, Army, you're often, well, I mean, you can be, you are, armed forces are at the receiving end of notifications. So have you got anything to share about any challenges it is to be at the receiving end of notifications of humanitarian premises or whatever?
Yes, Elizabeth, and before I start, I'll have to issue the normal caveat that even though I come from the MOD and my one-star boss is in the audience, I'm speaking in a personal capacity, and please don't attribute my remarks to anyone other than Mark Dacus. I think the challenges are dependent on the style and numerousness of the notifications. When Manu talks about 28,000 in Yemen, that's a huge challenge just in terms of information management, let alone anything else. If the notifications are around things like those that Michelle has just been describing, there's static locations, movements of convoys, those sort of things, they can be something that is used in the process of your planning and your conduct of operations. And in order to ensure that you are not causing civilian harm, that you are not striking civilian objects. The other issue with it is how current is the information. In terms of locations particularly, and looking at some of the locations that Manu mentions in the paper from the Yemen example, those locations could change in use. Something could be a civilian location on one day, and then because the humanitarian organization or whatever ceases to use it, and it is then occupied by armed forces from one of the warring parties, it stops becoming a civilian location, because its nature, purpose, location and use has changed. It's contributing to military activity. So that's the other difficulty. If you've got 28,000 locations, and how do you review how all 28,000 are being used? I mean, I think that would probably use the entire of the British Army's, in fact, defence's intelligence capability just to monitor that. So that's a difficulty. It does go into, the notifications will be used as part of the intelligence process in identifying where operations are going to be taking place, how to plan those operations, how to execute those operations. There'll be one part of the picture. You don't operate just on one piece of intelligence, as you yourself will know from your previous life. And so it will go in as part of the picture, it will be used. If it's a notification of, for instance, a movement, a humanitarian convoy or something of that nature, then that very well will be respected. And it will enable the armed forces to not engage or to try to keep operations away from that area as far as feasible. But there might be a necessity to operate in the area where that convoy is. As long as you're not operating against that convoy, you're within your legal obligations, but it may be necessary because of the state of the conflict or even just the local operating picture that you may have to operate in those vicinities. And the same in the vicinities of humanitarian warehouses and things of that nature. So there are challenges for it in how they're used, but they can assist if the belligerent party is serious about its obligations and wants to ensure that it doesn't harm and doesn't create problems and breach its obligation on humanitarian access.
Great, thank you. Manu, we've heard about some of the challenges. What's the law here? Because the Russians were saying, well, that hospital hasn't been notified, so we're right to bomb it.
Yes, and I think it's very important to understand the interplay between the protections the law provides and how, as Mark said, the notifications can assist parties to meet their obligations. Like all of the arrangements we're discussing, notifications don't affect the legal obligations, the protections. They're not the source of the protections. They're just a way of facilitating compliance with the law. So they don't affect the rules that protect civilian objects or the rules regulating the movement of humanitarian relief operations. So as Mark was saying, most frequently the objects that are notified are humanitarian facilities and movements of humanitarian vehicles and goods. These are civilian objects that IHL requires belligerents to respect and protect. They mustn't be the object of attack, and incidental damage to them must be factored into proportionality assessments. What's important to bear in mind is that the protection stems from IHL, not from the notification. There is no obligation to notify objects, and notification is not a precondition for protection under IHL. This is really important. So the argument, oh, you didn't notify and therefore it's not protected, simply doesn't hold water as a matter of law. However, as Mark was saying, civilian objects may lose protections, these protections, and become military objectives if by virtue of their location, purpose of use, they make an effective contribution to military action. So this is the point that, yes, if a humanitarian organization has control over the premise, it can say with a degree of conviction, it is not being used for military purposes. At the moment, the notification is made. Things can change, and so the fact something was notified doesn't mean that it remains a civilian object. It's up to belligerents to make this determination. So as I said, notification isn't a guarantee that the notified object hasn't lost its civilian status, nor the fact that the convoys, the facilities may be in the vicinity of military objectives and of operations. So what's important to bear in mind is attacks that strike or cause damage to notified facilities and movements aren't necessarily a violation of IHL. Their lawfulness of a particular strike depends on whether it complies with IHL. Was the object still civilian in nature? Were military operations taking place in the vicinity and a proportionality assessment was conducted? These are the criteria. So really important to bear in mind, they don't change the protections, the obligations, the ordinary rules of IHL.
Good. Going through the different humanitarian arrangements, we come to humanitarian pauses, ceasefires, truces, whatever you call them, pauses for humanitarian reasons. And I'm going to turn to you, Mark. Really, what's the difference between pauses and generalized ceasefires, and how do they affect the conduct of military operations?
Well, a pause is, a short a pause. Yes, it's trying to find pause without getting out the dictionary. It is a short break or a break for a determined period of time in the operations. If it's for humanitarian reasons, it could be agreed between the parties, although that has been demonstrably difficult in some circumstances. Pauses are not just for humanitarian reasons. Quite often the military will take a pause itself in its operations in order to reconstitute, redeploy, etc., what we would call an operational pause. Now that may give the opportunity for humanitarian access, etc., if it's made clear to the humanitarian organisation. But a pause, and I think we have seen some examples of this where operations have been ceased, often just by one party, in order to allow some form of delivery of humanitarian assistance. A ceasefire is a longer term thing, and Mark was referring to it there in Afghanistan, and is a negotiation between the belligerents who both agree. It can be bounded in time, whereas pauses could be a localized arrangement between commanders. Historically, you had pauses in order to recover the dead and wounded. So that a similar sort of arrangement locally could be done for humanitarian purposes, but a ceasefire is a longer thing, and it's normally with an aim to negotiating some sort of conclusion to the conflict. Now, it doesn't have to be for that reason, but
a humanitarian ceasefire will not be for that.
Will not be for that reason.
Yeah.
And a humanitarian ceasefire, I don't think I have heard of an example of such a thing.
Okay, but MSF is calling for one in Gaza, you mentioned, Michael. I mean, and others have done.
No, we could be in Gaza, and again, exceptionally, because a ceasefire is a political act. It actually tells the warring parties what to do with their war, and that's why it's exceptional. We are not calling for a humanitarian ceasefire, we're calling for a ceasefire, full stop, because of the absurdity at this moment of the violence and the humanitarian consequences of that. Because traditionally, again, as soon as you put the word humanitarian in front of it, whether it's the word ceasefire or pause or humanitarian zones of tranquility and other nice terms have been invented over the years to avoid this word ceasefire, then it becomes problematic, because then you kind of imply that not respecting civilians and their right to humanitarian assistance can only happen during those pauses or those ceasefires, and that outside of it, it's fair game. To make the humanitarian act and the protection of civilians exceptional rather than what it should be the norm throughout the conflict, and that's why normally We are very reluctant as soon as you put the word humanitarian in front of it, because that certainly is open to use and abuse. But again, in terms of practicalities, when you talk about every humanitarian movement across a front line requires warring parties, and it's no good if only one of the warring parties does that, to actually agree to a cessation of hostilities during that movement. So whenever you have this kind of a movement, it's always a specific road and a specific time, because on both sides they have to agree to stop shooting for a while, to let our patients or our convoy of medicines or our staff through. Is that a pause? Well, yes, it is a pause, because for a couple of hours they stop shooting at each other to let us through. Now that is again just a day-to-day pragmatic application that doesn't depend on big political announcement, but just depends on local commanders on either side of the front line. And as long as it's not politicized, it actually works. As soon as you make it into a big issue, where either one or the other side of the conflict thinks they will be losing face or military advantage or political advantage by agreeing, and that's kind of the rhetoric we see around Gaza. Everybody has an opinion about, oh, it should be a pause, it should be a ceasefire, it should be a humanitarian ceasefire, it should be a corridor, it should be... but that doesn't help you with the practicalities on the ground. That's why for Gaza we keep it simple. You know, this is becoming so absurd. That's the only thing that will give any alleviation to the suffering of the people now, is to just stop. But exceptional, not the norm.
Thank you. Mark, I've just got a question online. I don't know if you can help with. A lot of questions are about Gaza. Given the events in Gaza, are we going to increasingly see or need aid workers with robust military backgrounds in order to get humanitarian assistance into difficult conflict areas? And how is Gaza shaping humanitarian aid thinking for the future?
My immediate reaction is no, because I think that sort of almost suggests that you're militarizing humanitarian assistance, which is not the direction that you want to go into, and making a clear distinction between the humanitarian nature of assistance and the military, and the role of the military is one of the most fundamental elements of this entirely. And a lot of confusion has arisen in the past, where people confuse the two roles. And I think I've been involved in organizations which discourage the wearing of military-style combat uniforms and other things that might be confuse them as military actors. So I think it also touches on, I think which Manu and I have talked about in the past, is one of the problems with deconfliction, is that the various security elements of humanitarian organizations are now increasingly involved in the management of deconfliction, and it becomes less a humanitarian issue and more a security management issue, and I think those create challenges for the humanitarian community.
Manu, do you want to finish up on humanitarian pauses?
Yes, a point that I want to make is that we've heard calls by the UN General Assembly, by the Security Council, in addition to many political actors, for ceasefires. And when these are issued, they are precisely that. They are a call, an exhortation to the parties to the hostilities to stop the fighting for humanitarian purposes. But they are just that. They are a call. It remains for the parties, for the belligerents on the ground, to actually reach agreement. It cannot be imposed upon them. For a cessation of hostilities, a ceasefire for humanitarian purposes to be safe, all the sides that are participating in hostilities in that particular area need to agree to it.
Thank you. Turning now to the next one, which is humanitarian corridors. What are they?
Oh, that's simple. They're just arrangements to facilitate the movement of civilians, other persons protected by IHL, such as the wounded and sick, and the delivery of humanitarian assistance. And they're usually established, or rather, they're usually calls for their establishment in situations of active hostilities when movements are particularly dangerous. They're usually a geographic route that can be employed for the purposes that have been agreed upon for a specific time frame. It can be established as a one-off opportunity to transit at a specific date and time, or at recurring dates and times.
And Mark, can you tell us what the limitations of corridors are? Because what we seem to be doing is explaining what these humanitarian arrangements are, and then we find that they have problems, all of them, and abuses. What are the limitations of humanitarian corridors?
Well, I think the limitations are in part that they constrain the delivery of aid to a corridor rather than to providing aid to the population in need. I mean, while they can be useful to perhaps to get to specific locations, but the issues are as much about the constraints that humanitarian corridors place on the delivery of assistance overall. I mean, there are also, I mean, I seem to remember from my own past policy in the UN that there are, I think, Oslo guidelines as well for the use of military vehicles in corridors and air corridors. I mean, there are a series of internal guidelines about where military vehicles can be used and how they can be used, which I think is one of the issues, because one of the constraints has been, in some cases, particularly when we're talking about airlifts, it's just the capacity doesn't necessarily exist amongst the humanitarian community to deliver at the sort of scale that might be required. So there is, I think, there is guidance still on this.
Thank you. And Michiel, MSF are reluctant to call for humanitarian corridors, I believe. Why is that?
Yeah, for the same reason as these humanitarian pauses, that you make it the exception rather than the rule, and that opens it up to abuse. So to give a contemporary example, we're still hanging on to 3 hospitals in Khartoum, a city of 2 million people, and we estimate between 3 and 4 million are left. That's a lot of people. Whereas since last October, the Sudanese authorities have effectively first they blocked all surgical supplies to Khartoum with the argument that you can also treat wounded combatants, and any kind of appeal to international law that's not only what we can do, it's what we have to do, and it's our obligation, but that goes on to deaf ears. That is not something new, and then effectively it became a complete ban on any kind of humanitarian supplies to Khartoum, and that has been in place now since the end of October. So where are we now? It's almost 4 or 5 months? 5 months. Where then the negotiations are about opening corridors across the front line to Khartoum, as if that is the exception, rather than just re-establishing the day-to-day practice, which we were able to do before, where we negotiate with each commander on each side of the front line to allow us on Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock to cross that front line, where for an hour or so they stop shooting at each other, which worked perfectly fine between May and October, to have a continuous not only flow of medical and humanitarian access to Khartoum, but also critically for a medical organization, the ability to evacuate critical patients that need complicated care out of Khartoum to functioning facilities. But by the military decision to block that access, and that then translates into a negotiation about opening corridors, as if that's the exception rather than the rule. So yes, historically we do not have good experience with states or non-state armed groups that are invoking this humanitarian corridor narrative, because usually it's more a mechanism to constrain rather than to help humanitarian assistance.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, do you want to say anything about what operational arrangements need to be in place for humanitarian corridors when they are put in place?
There's two situations, and one of the ones is one that Michelle has just referred to, where it's a corridor crossing the front line, as opposed to a corridor in territory occupied by one party. Now, if it's crossing the front line, as with pauses, you're going to need agreement. Now, that agreement could be done at a local level, as it sounds as though it was being done in Khartoum. And that would allow for the corridor to be open for a certain period of time, for a certain purpose. Establishing humanitarian corridors, as it were, permanently, I think is probably an unlikely aspiration to be fulfilled. And it's easier, obviously, if you're doing it on the territory occupied by only one party, where the conflict may still be going on, there may still be bombings, etc., but they set aside a place for you to transit. But it's going across front lines, or given the nature of modern armed conflict, there actually aren't front lines in many cases. You've got this sort of almost a mosaic of activity going on, into which you're then trying to establish a corridor, and that operationally would be very, very difficult, particularly if there's a state on one side and a non-state actor on another, and you're not sure of the degree of control within the forces of the non-state actor. So establishing them, as we've heard, is difficult. It's probably best done at a local level, and it's only going to be for short periods of time.
Thank you. Moving on to humanitarian evacuations. Manu, how do we use that term?
Yes, so evacuations are arrangements that allow people protected by IHL to move from locations where they are insecure, either because they face risks from military operations or because they can't access adequate food, water, and other basic goods and services. Now, the expression evacuations is used colloquially to cover at least 3, but probably more, ways in which such relocations can take place. There are some evacuations that are expressly foreseen by IHL, which either requires parties to a conflict to relocate particular categories of protected people, such as the wounded and sick members of states' armed forces and prisoners of war, or otherwise strongly encourages them to do so in the case of particularly vulnerable civilians in besieged or encircled areas. So we've got the evacuations that are expressly foreseen by IHL. We also use the term to refer to situations where civilians move autonomously from areas affected by hostilities. And then also situations where humanitarian organizations conduct organized relocations of civilians and other protected people. And then, just to add to it, IHL treaties use the term evacuation in a completely different way to refer to exceptions to the prohibition of forced displacement.
Just spell that out. There is a prohibition in international humanitarian law. You may not force.
Yes, there's a prohibition on forcibly displacing civilians, but in situations of occupation, the occupying power is allowed to undertake the total or partial evacuation of an area if this is required for the security of the population or for imperative military reasons. So those are referred to as evacuations. These displacements are temporary, and displaced persons must be transferred back as soon as hostilities in the area have ceased. So there's a similar entitlement to displace the civilian population also in situations of non-international armed conflict. Now, while the other evacuations that I just mentioned, the autonomous ones and the ones conducted by humanitarian organizations, are consensual, so there's no obligation on civilians to take part in those, these evacuations that are an exception to the prohibition of forced displacement are not consensual. The civilians involved are not required to agree to them. IHL doesn't specify who should be conducting the evacuations in these circumstances, but it does require that to the greatest practical extent, the displacement must be conducted in satisfactory conditions of hygiene, health, safety and nutrition, and that proper accommodation be provided to receive the displaced persons.
Okay, thank you very much. I did ask you. Michel, we turn to you again. MSF and evacuations.
Well, as a medical organization, of course, when you talk about evacuations, we usually refer to medical evacuations, where there's a simple necessity for medical reasons to reach a medical facility that can deal with that. So, but of course, that's not what we're talking about. But that also requires negotiation, because again, that requires often at very inconvenient hours in the middle of the night, or to open routes or front lines, often in situations where a curfew or other restrictions of movements are in place. Now that's a specialty in itself, but of course the key with the other type of evacuations is indeed the voluntary nature. So it will be again very exceptional. Any humanitarian organization, and MSF is no exception, of course, would never take part in a forced evacuation. But even the voluntary evacuations risk to be politicized quite quickly for parties to suggest that certain populations need to move from an area. Very often there's an underlying agenda to remove particular ethnicities from an area and not allow them to go back. Two very recent examples are, of course, first in last year in Sudan, in Darfur, where one of the warring parties had an interest to cleanse the area of West Darfur of the entirety of the Masalit population, and would suggest in between also killing a lot of them, that people are better off evacuating themselves to Chad. But this debate again came up in Gaza when suggestions were made to evacuate people to safety in Egypt. But again, the underlying agenda was, once they're out of Gaza, they will never be able to return, which of course has also a historical resonance in the Israel-Palestine problematic over the last 60 years. So these are two examples where voluntary evacuations are suggested by a warring party, but where you can easily get then implicated in what is essentially this is used for ethnic engineering rather than for safety purposes. So two examples which show that how careful you need to be, even if it's of voluntary nature.
Thank you. Mark, in your experience, is there anything you want to mention about evacuations and whether humanitarian organisations or OCHA for that matter?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that my involvement in evacuations was also linked to the UN's duty of care towards both staff and towards key individuals. So we would evacuate, by which we meant move to a place of safety, which was usually outside the country. And I think that the definition of taking people outside the country was important, particularly for people like rights workers, people who have been involved in providing evidence of atrocities and abuse would be afforded the evacuation. And we saw that in Afghanistan as part of our duty of care towards those people that we were involved in. So I think that's another element to it. I mean, it's a fraught issue in the UN overall because at the time of the major, I think we call it evacuation from Kabul, there was a major internal discussion about who should be evacuated, who should be prioritized, how you manage that. There were the UN agencies as a whole felt that their responsibility was to stay and deliver. And unless their staff were known to be at risk, that they shouldn't be subject to evacuation. But I think that was where other people considered anybody who was anybody associated with foreign organizations was at risk. I actually don't think that was the case, and has proven not to be the case. But it's become a sort of internal UN concern about the nature of evacuation of aid workers and staff to safety.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to, before I come back to the panel on one or two other questions, I'd just like to open the floor if there are questions. There are a couple over here. Just wait for the microphone if you wouldn't mind, and then identify yourself, please.
Ian Martin. I'm a member of Chatham House, and I've worked for the UN in a number of conflict and post-conflict situations. Appreciation to all the panel, even if your calm and rational discussion has sometimes seemed a little surreal as we think of what's actually going on in the world at the moment. I pay tribute to the work of MSF in particular in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan and other places, and of UN colleagues in UNRWA and so on. I'm not a lawyer, but I actually want to advocate more discussion of the law, because it seems to me at the moment we have the paradox of infinite references to international humanitarian law from our politicians and almost zero public discussion as to what the requirements of international humanitarian law actually are. No public discussion of when is a civilian rather than a combatant in the context of Gaza. Little discussion about what's happened to the hospitals or the evacuation of patients from hospitals. I could go on. I chaired a UN Board of Inquiry into deaths, injuries and damages at UN premises in Gaza after Operation Cast Lead. There was another in 2014. They talked about strengthened coordination arrangements. Despite that, the number, I can't even quote the number of UNRWA premises, UN premises that have been attacked in Gaza. So my question is, what can be done to bring this into appropriate public discussion? I'm sure the International Law Programme isn't turning down lots of requests to appear on the Today programme, but we have this paradox of parroting the importance of international humanitarian law while it is collapsing in practice.
What a wonderful question. Thank you so much. You get enormous grins from British Red Cross here, from anyone from the International Law Programme. Manu, I'm going to put that to you. How can we get IHL across more? Yes.
So as you said, we are receiving lots of queries from the media, for example. One of the challenges from the media is that they want sound bites. So I always say, I'm happy to speak to you if you give me 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Some media say, yes, please, let's have a proper conversation. Other parts of the media are just not interested in this. And the answer in IHL is never going to be a 2-minute soundbite. So I think that's a challenge. I don't know whether you've put the question to me, Elizabeth, because I'm keen to elaborate some kind of project that allows us to engage with the media in a systematic manner, both preemptively, so that there is a degree of familiarity with the law in peacetime, but also set up a system to be able to have a conversation with them when they have specific issues as conflict unravels. So I completely agree with you. It's important to have this debate. It's important for this debate to be informed. And the media needs to be willing to educate itself. And that's just one side. That's just the media. I can tell you about the dissemination I do at my kids' school, and they love it. And they come up with amazing answers.
How old are your kids? Just
When I
explain
first
that.
started, they were 5 and 7, and they loved it.
International humanitarian law for primary schools.
It's better
She'll
now.
do it for you.
They are now 14, and they have taken over the role play. They are giving it to the smaller kids. That's how much appetite there is.
But Ian, can I throw the question back to you? How do you think? Because in a way, it's not just debate, it is education. How do you think IHL, the distinction, civilians and combatants, protection of hospitals, all of this, how do you think it can be better played out in this country?
I don't entirely agree that it takes 20 minutes to discuss who's a combatant and who's a civilian in the context of Hamas and so on. And you're right, of course, you've got to reduce these issues to something that can be understood. But what strikes me is their absence from the debate. And yes, I do think you have to target the media because that's the way people are hearing it. And challenge the politicians. I mean, politicians can't get away with saying everything must be done within accordance with international humanitarian law and never answering a question as to whether they think X or Y actually is in accordance with international humanitarian law.
Thank you. Another question back there, right at the back there. Thank you.
Thank you. Alana Travers. I work for an NGO in Iraq. It's more post-conflict justice. But what struck me reading this report, thank you, by the way, in this talk, is maybe potentially the absence of engagement with civilians, or who's working on, lessons from what civilians in these areas want and need. And sometimes, I know from my experience working in Iraq, there's too much talking about what people might want rather than what they want. And I think it's ever more crucial to kind of address that. So if there's anything you could raise about research or focus on.
Thank you very much. And just behind there, was there someone else? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Tamer Badawi. I'm a PhD student at the University of Kent. I research tribal networks and collective mobilization in wartime. I have this question about when you mentioned that there are atomized conflicts, and in those conflicts you have a plethora of actors operating, maybe militias, maybe rebel groups, maybe organized crime, and all of those groups, they have different structures. Some of them are very cohesive, some of them are very fragmented. You have different typologies of armed groups where you have also some of them have like a strong civilian component, some of them are very like hierarchical and ideological with like a minimal civilian component. So how do you design, for example, humanitarian assistance, ceasefires? Like, would you design different toolboxes for those armed groups, or would you have one toolbox, and would you tailor it to different situations and different armed group typologies? I went through your paper, Emanuela, very quickly. I know you can always go very granular. So, I know there are different dimensions that can be, researched further, but yeah.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And there is another one here, please. Sorry, and I'll get you next, but just so then we'll have 3.
Hi, Sarah Tamimi from the ICJP. I echo what Ian said, and my question is going to bring us back a bit to international law specifically. So basically, hospitals lose the extra layer of protection when harmful acts are committed from there. So does the threshold to decide on such an attack in the context of hospitals change? Does it become a bit higher than, for instance, in the context of a regular area that is being used to commit a harmful act?
Okay, got it. hospitals are being used by combatants. Okay, 3 questions. The first one I'm going to give to you, Manu. Is there enough focus on what the civilians really need and want? And then I'm going to ask Michael, what happens if you're in a very complex environment with lots of armed groups, this, that, and the other? Do you use the same tools? And then I'm going to go back to you. Perhaps you can deal with both of them, Manu. Oh, no, I'm going to ask Mark about the hospitals used for combatants. Right, Manu, off we go.
Thank you. The engagement with local communities, I flagged it in relation, I think, just to evacuation. I specifically noted the importance of engaging with communities to understand their desires and their needs. I'm just wondering to what extent it's as of immediate relevance, for example, to the ceasefire and to the humanitarian notifications. I think in relation to humanitarian notifications, Michel made a really important point. They were supporting local hospitals and consulted the local hospitals. Do you want to be notified, yes or no? So in relation to that modality, there was engagement. So I think maybe there isn't much said because with regard to some of the modalities, it's just not so relevant. But with regard to evacuations and even just engaging with the community to tell them there is going to be a humanitarian corridor at this particular moment in time. This is who can participate. This is where you're going to go is key. And you'd think that this is one of the issues that the humanitarian actors on the ground would be doing, even if they're not themselves involved in any shape or form. They would carry out this outreach to the community because the reality is that it's more likely to be humanitarian actors that can actually go and engage with the local community than the parties to the conflict.
Thank you. Michael, complex environments, different non-state actors, all of that.
Yeah, for that, because it's we are talking a lot here about Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, but they're essentially all 3 of them two-party conflicts with massive military actors, whilst the majority of the conflicts outside of that will be more atomized. I will focus on one particular one to answer that question. It's certainly for MSF in the top 5 crises at the moment, but a bit underreported, and that's Haiti. Why Haiti? Because it is not traditional armed groups there with political, although now they start to have a political agenda, but they are gangs. They are gangs that are controlling different parts of the capital, Port-au-Prince, that have now, since February, essentially taken over the capital and made the country government non-existent in practice on the ground. And because these are armed gangs, and not so much until now political actors, all the years that MSF has been supporting a number of hospitals there, we had to still engage with them, and we had our own question, like, do we have to engage with them differently? It turns out, in practice, no. That when you have a certain power over a population, the arguments that you use to get them to agree to the basics of IHL, even if you don't call it IHL, protection of the hospitals, free passage of civilians and patients and this and that, turns out to be roughly the same, and it's usually linked also to the self-interest of these groups, whether it's a non-state armed groups in eastern DRC or what do you call it, criminal gang in Port-au-Prince that you use it. So initially we thought you would need a different toolkit. In practice, actually, it turns out you don't, and the dynamics are relatively similar, which enables MSF to still maintain a number of hospitals in Port-au-Prince, even though the majority of the humanitarians and the diplomatic corps have evacuated. That's a different form of evacuation, Port-au-Prince in February. What is noticeable, however, in all these negotiations is indeed that the neutrality of the hospitals is usually questioned by the state authorities, not so much about the local groups. And then that is more related to your question. Every time anywhere in the world a hospital of MSF gets attacked, whether it's in Kunduz in Afghanistan or in Yemen bombed by the Saudi Air Force, or in Syria by the Syrian Air Force, or elsewhere, it's usually on that argument, but this hospital has now as a military purpose, and you see the same in Gaza. We are attacking this hospital because 20 meters under the hospital there is a military facility. And that definition is sliding a bit. So in many of those cases, the argument becomes, but because you are also treating combatants, Taliban in the case of Afghanistan, Houthi fighters in the case of Yemen, members of different armed groups in Syria. So because you have these patients in your hospital and they're making a phone call, therefore it's a command and control center and it's legitimate for us to bomb it. So you see a sliding scale. And reversely, we see that now in Haiti, where the armed gangs, the criminal gangs, are completely respecting the facilities where MSF works, but reversely are attacking and making dysfunctional quite a number of other hospitals because they belong to the government, and therefore they mistrust the neutrality of those hospitals.
Thank you. Mark, the law.
So I think, certainly from my perspective, the slippage that you just talked about there, where you're getting down to there's one person who's making a phone call, and therefore you go to that's a command and control center. I don't think we would slip that far. I'm not saying that it hasn't happened, but in terms of the question as to how is that decision made. It's a military decision based upon it's all if that is how if that decision as to whether or not the hospital has lost its protection will be made on the basis of intelligence, and if there isn't enough intelligence to demonstrate that it has, if the intelligence was somebody in the hospital made a phone call, then I think any responsible, law-abiding military, and I happen to work for one, any responsible, law-abiding military would not think that lost its protection. Obviously, there are circumstances where it can happen, and that is going to be a legally informed decision made, as all decisions to conduct operations are made by a military commander. Now, it will be legally informed. It will also be policy informed, because there may be a policy wrap on top of the law, and lawyers, military lawyers particularly, IHL lawyers particularly, both military and non-military, always get slightly annoyed, I would say, when people conflate policy restrictions with legal restrictions. Because often the policy restrictions that are put on top of the law greatly restrict your military action. And people will say, but people will point and say, well, it's the law that stopped that, and often it isn't. So there may be, for example, if a hospital has been notified, say an MSF facility has been notified to us, it will have gone into the intelligence process. It will probably have been put on a list of buildings not to be engaged or not to conduct military operations around. And then in order to lift that restriction, there would have to be a very high degree of certainty that it was being used in a certain way, and B, following that, legal consideration that it had lost the protection, and then a decision would be made as to what to do about that. And all the other aspects of the decision-making process would come in. You would consider proportionality, you would consider all those other things. So, and that would not be a low-level decision. That would be a high-level decision. I think what we are seeing in the examples that Michelle has referred to is that sort of decision-making process perhaps not being followed, and individuals at a low level taking decisions to engage facilities. There's also, I think, have I answered the question? Have I answered the question?
There's a question up here, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Dominic Carrot, member. The initial discussion was great. It's got much more interesting since we've got into practical examples. So thank you, Ian, and thank you, Mark and Michiel. Let's draw on those. So again, I hear what you say about rational governments will go to the highest level. Ideally, right?
I go to the highest level.
No, not the highest. We can't blame Sunak for everything.
No.
But obviously we get what David Miliband called the age of impunity. And also, I think we've got criminal gangs now.
Make it a question.
So we've got criminal gangs now. So within that, is it right to talk about a legal framework, IHL? And if so, who enforces it, under what jurisdiction?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give that to Manu. Yes, and in the front, please, here, and then halfway down.
Thank you. Noel True, British Red Cross. This one's a question for Colonel Dacker, perhaps with your San Remo hat on. How and to what extent do state armed forces practice the nuts and bolts of either setting up a humanitarian arrangement or giving effect to one? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then halfway down there.
Hi, Juliette Lezé, human security student at King's College. It kind of resonates with your question, I think. We talk a lot about the law here, and to me the law works when there is consequences. So in the last 10 years or so, has there been any consequences to states or armed groups if those haven't been respected?
Did you get one?
Consequences of violating the law.
Okay, thank you very much. Manu, you get the first and the third of those. Who judges? What's the legal framework to? Yes, in about 3 sentences. And what are the concepts?
So the gangs. Does IHL apply if the situation of violence meets the relevant criteria? If the gangs are sufficiently organised? If the fighting has the requisite level of intensity and duration? Accountability, I prefer to promote compliance with the law so that violations don't happen in the first place. And I think what Michelle was saying about the importance of trying to engage with these gangs to tell them, maybe not invoking the language of IHL, but saying what they should and shouldn't be doing, is extremely important in this context, and getting them to do what is necessary. So that's what I'd say. Everyone's always very interested in accountability. Again, I really much prefer promoting compliance. So are there consequences for violations of the law? Yes, frequently sanctions have been imposed on individuals and groups. There are various proceedings before international and national tribunals, both in terms of violations and also preemptively. For example, there's litigation in a number of states in relations to arms transfers, and there's a multitude of individual criminal responsibility proceedings taking place both internationally and domestically. So many avenues for accountability. Yes, I keep on saying I wish we focused more on promoting compliance rather than punishing violations.
Okay, Mark, the nuts and bolts, but could you also say, is there training or doctrine that for your forces for any of these humanitarian arrangements?
So are the nuts and bolts concentrated on? They are, but they're obviously not the primary focus. But it is taken into account, and I believe my successor in Sanremo and his counterpart in the Refugee Law Department are looking at putting a sort of joint course together, bringing humanitarian actors and the military together, because that's one of the big problems, is that we don't always talk to each other that much. And that is an issue in and of itself.
Sorry, when you talk to each other, you're talking about military and civilian, military and humanitarian organisations. Yeah, thanks.
But progress can be made on that, and it should be improved. And in terms of training in this country, if there are a number of exercises where there is what we call a white cell, which is people who are either currently working in humanitarian organizations or previously have done, and they try to input into the planning of operations and the execution of operations, those things, those concerns. And there is doctrine on it, primarily NATO doctrine, which is what we use now. But that tends to be more broad on civil-military cooperation. It does touch on cooperating with humanitarian actors. It doesn't go down to the detail of looking at these sort of arrangements necessarily. So I hope that answers your question and answers your question.
Thank you. And Mark, can I just turn to you? Because obviously the key to successful humanitarian arrangements is that agreement between both parties. And is that helped by having an intermediary? And is that something that the UN does? Should do, whatever?
Yes, sometimes. Yes, I think it is helped by having an intermediary. I think the challenge for intermediaries, particularly talking about atomized conflict, is the ability to maintain your neutrality, and for the UN to maintain its neutrality in many circumstances. In some cases, Somalia, the UN is seen as a combatant, and certainly in the DRC. So those are challenges for the UN. It's part of the reason why there's been a discussion about integrated missions and the distinction between peacekeepers and humanitarians there, which is still a live discussion in the UN. I mean, just make a comment on some of the other issues, if I might, which is really to say on all these issues, what strikes me is that with notifications, humanitarian corridors and other things, you actually need to have mechanisms in place beforehand to be able to make these issues work.
Sorry, when you say beforehand, before the...
Well, I mean, you need to have some mechanisms in place. I mean, the issue of notifications, for example, also requires, in the case of Afghanistan, it required an acceptance by both the government and the Taliban as to what was considered to be a health facility or whatever, and protection. And in fact, the Taliban turned out to be rather better at respecting that than the government. So you also needed mechanisms in place when those had been broken, when there'd been events such as Kunduz, which was an awful situation where the hospital continued to be attacked, even though it was listed and notified that there was a mechanism in place. And by mechanism, I mean we had access to CENTCOM, the High Command, and the attacks continued. So you need some of these mechanisms in place to make sure that notifications can be acted upon. So I think that's and that goes also for when you're dealing with atomized conflicts, the challenge there has been, and I'm doing work on South Sudan, is that in many cases, the command and control structures just don't operate at the lower level. I mean, you can talk to the higher levels of the command of militias and others, but they don't operate at the lower level. Those, I think, are some of the challenges that the humanitarian coordinator sometimes tries to respond to and to bring into place.
Thank you very much. There are drinks upstairs now. There is one question online which came in very early, which is essentially what can and should humanitarian organizations do in Gaza. I think we've almost answered that by showing how very difficult it is for a number of reasons. If you have any other questions, just come upstairs, have a drink. All right, I can't resist one more question over here, but that's the last. Françoise Hampson.
Thanks very much. Françoise Hampson, Emeritus Professor at the University of Essex. A quick comment on when a hospital loses protection. It is not enough for acts harmful to the enemy to occur. There is an obligation. It's the only case in IHL. There's an obligation to give a warning. If you haven't given a warning, the strike cannot be lawful. On Ian's point, there is an unused asset. Members of the Red Cross movement and Red Crescent movement, the British Red Cross has got members in every constituency. When you're dealing with massive violations, why aren't they writing to their MPs? It's not political. It doesn't matter which political party you belong to or none of them. They should be the Red Cross movement should be getting its members to put pressure on governments to raise issues in the General Assembly and Security Council.
Thank you so much, Françoise. So you got that about hospitals, warning must be given, and you got that about the British Red Cross. All right, drinks upstairs. Thank you. Oh, please join me in thanking our speakers.